Welcome back, my friends, to the D-Rate the Hate podcast. I am your host, Wilk of WilksWorld.com, and I am so incredibly grateful that you are taking the time to join me for another powerful DTH episode. Friends, at the D-Rate the Hate podcast, it's all about bettering the world one attitude at a time. See, we did not create the hate, but with your help, we can derate the hate. That all starts with gratitude and personal accountability. We cannot control everything that happens to us in life, but we can control how we react to it. How we act, how we react, no matter what happens to us, how we react to it makes the difference. Friends, there is only one good thing about a bad attitude, and that is that we have the ability as individuals to change it. Here on the DTH podcast, we strive to bring you great guests and provide tools to do just that. Please be sure to share it with your friends. Subscribe if you haven't done so. Ratings and feedback are always greatly appreciated. And with that, let's get to this week's episode. Friends, I am so excited to be back in the seat. First conversation of 2024 with a new friend of mine. Somebody I'm so excited to bring to you today. You probably heard me talk about it before, but I cannot overstate the importance of a true dialogue. The importance of conversation, especially conversations with those people who we may disagree with, right? I've talked about it before. The only way we can obtain true knowledge, the only way we can really bridge the divide is to have conversations with people of differing mindsets, different opinions, different thoughts than our own. This week's guest is an incredible person who talks a lot about this subject. Jonathan Rauch is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. He's the author of 8 books and many, many articles on public policy, culture, and government. He is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and the recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award, the magazine industry's equivalent to the Pulitzer Prize. His latest book, published in 2021 by the Brookings Press, is The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, a spirited and deep-diving account of how to push back against disinformation, canceling, and other new threats to our fact-based epistemic order. Now, Jonathan Rauch once said, "Acquiring knowledge is a conversation, not a destination." So much of what Jonathan and I talk about in this conversation today is about how do we acquire knowledge? How do we determine what is truth and what is maybe just troll outrage bait? So stay tuned, my friends, for a little bit about the Constitution of Knowledge, what's going on with Jonathan, what's going on with me, our common cause and passion for depolarization, and so much more. With that, Jonathan Rauch, here we go. Jonathan Rauch, thank you for joining me on the D-Rate the Hate podcast, my friend. So good to see you.
I am happy to be here and to be one of your new friends.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I first became aware of you, John, in July. I had seen stuff, things that you had written before and articles and whatnot, but I never really dove into your work until you participated in the Braver Angels convention in Gettysburg back in July of 2023, and at that point, I found your book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, and I had to dive into that, and that's really the first thing or part of what I want to talk about today. Obviously, there's way too many things in that book to go into in depth, but that's where I want to start, because that is something that I believe is one of the biggest polarizers right now is truth and misinformation, right? So just first of all, just start off and talk to me about how you decided you were going to do this Constitution of Knowledge, the truth epistemology and things like that. Where did that start for you?
Well, my interest in the subject goes back to, I published a book in 1993 called Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, and that was about attacks coming in different directions, but including what was then called political correctness on free speech and free thought. And it argued that where knowledge comes from is a robust exchange of criticism, and these new people were the latest in a long stream of people who were trying to shut down inquiry and criticism. So about 25, 26, 27 years later, the argument over wokeness, as political correctness came to be called, was coming back, and we were seeing a whole new direction of threats to knowledge, free speech, and open inquiry, and the ability to detect the difference between truth and falsehood. And I realized I had to update that book, and I had to take into account something I missed the first time around. First time the book was about knowledge comes from marketplace of ideas. We all say our piece, we criticize each other, the best ideas at the end of the day. That's as close as we are on that given day to truth. We try to improve it every day. That is all true as far as it goes. I am a fan of the marketplace of ideas as a metaphor, but I had come to realize that wasn't enough, that just unstructured debate and criticism is a quick downhill trajectory because so many people do what you see on Twitter and social media, which is exaggeration, trolling, half-truths, conspiracy theories, attention getting, tribal behavior, outrage, and so forth. And so I realized that the missing element is structure, that we have a lot of rules that we obey that have come down to us in 300 years of hard work that structure our discourse in science and journalism and law and government and require us to uphold certain standards in seeking and claiming truth. And that's the constitution of knowledge. It's not a metaphor. It really is rules. A lot of them are written down. And so that's the key concept. And it won't have escaped you that it's similar to, and to some extent inspired by, the key concept of braver angels, which is if you just put people, reds and blues, in a room together and say, get to know each other, have at it, that's not likely to go well. If you provide them with some structure and guidance for how to go about that conversation, it goes much better. Well, the same thing is true on a social level, and that's the big insight of the constitution of knowledge.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing because one of the first lines in that book that really stood out to me that I really liked because it goes to so much of what I talk about is acquiring knowledge is a conversation, not a destination. And that line right there, when I first saw that, it jumped out to me so much because friends of mine like Monica Guzman from Braver Angels, talks about curious conversations and really getting in there and getting to know somebody for who they are. And so many people that I've talked to on this podcast, it's really about the humanity. We don't have to agree on everything, but as long as we're able to have that conversation and have it in a civil way, we can move through a lot of our differences and really acquire that knowledge from those other.
Exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the key insight of what I called way back in 1993 liberal science. That's the system, the social system we use to structure those conversations. Dissent and disagreement are poisonous to most societies. And the miracle of the rules of the constitution of knowledge is that if you channel dissent and disagreement, if you pit prejudice against prejudice and bias against bias in a structured conversation that forces people to come to some kind of consensus over time in order to claim knowledge, you can turn those disagreements into the raw material for the advancement of knowledge. I call it the Constitution of Knowledge, partly because it mirrors Madison's United States Constitution, which famously, Madison says, what's the only force that can safely cope with political ambition? The answer is you pit ambition against ambition. And you use a lot of structures to do that. In order to get something done, the president has to go talk to Congress. They both have to talk to the courts. There's going to be state and there's going to be local. But only through that process can you turn the heat of conflict into the light of policy. And the Constitution of Knowledge works just the same way.
The cool thing about this book, and I want people to really get this because this was one of the things that stood out as being so incredible about this book, is you draw a lot of parallels between not only our U.S. Constitution and the way that the U.S. Constitution was built, but you also harken back to the way, I give the I give the internet and this internet ecosystem that is so full of poison right now, in my opinion. But I give it a lot of grief because in a lot of ways I think it's just this dumpster fire of hate, lies, and misinformation. But you talk about how there are similarities in what's going on today and what happened back when like the first printing press, came out, and all of a sudden this information was flying at people at a much faster rate than it ever did before because everything, now they've got typesetters, they've got printing presses, they've got the ability to crank these books out much, much more quickly. So the amount of information that they were able to acquire back then and the things that they were encountering then are not totally unsimilar to what we're seeing today.
Yeah, there's a broad parallel. Of course, the particulars are very different, but we've had multiple disruptions in history where new media have come along and created information flows and misinformation flows and disinformation flows, which were very disruptive to society. Now, the bad news in the case of the biggest of those revolutions, which was the invention of a movable type, is that it took about 150 years of warfare, mostly between Protestants and Catholics, but also between Protestants and Protestants. But it took about 150 years for all of that to settle down. The good news is that over time, people developed rules and institutions that taught them how to use these new tools proactively. We saw another crisis, not as severe, but more instructive, in the late 19th century. As you may know, the invention of offset printing allowed the production of, you could print copies of the Chicago Tribune and distribute it in a matter of hours. And that created these big media companies. And at that point in the late 19th century, American news media, print media, was a kind of sewer of hyper partisanship and fake news. They put in whatever would sell papers until they started realizing that they were poisoning their own audiences and their own environment. And then what we saw in the beginning of the 20th century, starting in the early years, we saw the establishment of journalism schools and prizes like the Pulitzer. Maybe most importantly, we saw the Association of Newspaper Editors form and create a set of rules for papers. Like, sounds obvious today, but don't make stuff up, run corrections.
Right, right.
And it really only took about a generation or two generations to go from William Randolph Hearst to the greats of mid-century American journalism. Mm-hmm. And so what needs to happen in these cases is for social institutions and norms to catch up with these new technologies. It takes a while. And of course, in the interim, well, first, there's no guarantee of success because, as we may discuss in a moment, there are powerful forces that are working against the Constitution of knowledge right now and working against the mission of braver angels. And they are determined and they are smart. So we can't just assume that this process ends up the way you and I might want it to.
Right.
But even if it does, there's this period of transition, which we seem to be in right now, which can be a race to the bottom. And to me, one reason I am a founding board member, no longer, but was, of Braver Angels and an evangelist to this day, is that depolarization is one of the key things that we need to do to be able to better handle this new media and information world.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about how well, another thing that you've talked about in the book there, John, with how the internet was built on this model of marketing, and it was all about the clicks, and then you get these trolls out there, or I call them outrage entrepreneurs, right?
Yes.
I mean, we live in this age of
conflict
outrage.
entrepreneurs. Yes.
Yeah. I call them grievance grifters, outrage entrepreneurs. they have this unique ability to get people whipped up in anger. And one of my things that I always try to drive home to people that I'm coaching or speaking with or whatever is never allow your emotions to dictate your actions. But what has happened with this internet ecosystem of ours is these outrage entrepreneurs and grievance grifters have this unique ability to get people to engage when they're outraged, and just these ugly things, they go viral. But that's the model that like you talk about some of these big forces that, you know, they profit greatly off that, um that outrage. They profit greatly off the number of clicks and the sheer, what is it, interaction or clicks or I can't even think of the
Likes,
word.
shares, all of that stuff.
Yeah, all of that stuff is models for marketing, and so the question then is how do we, as people who know that polarization is one of the greatest issues of our time, as people who know that it will only be a conversation and the civility that's going to bring us, bring us through this thing, you know. But that does not fit the model for these clicks and these, you know.
Yeah, well, that's a challenge, of course. Now, I should say that just by way of preface, social media is not, in my opinion, the biggest media source of division and misinformation. It may not even be number two. I think number one is still the oldest and best, or maybe worst, which is politicians
Oh yeah, for sure.
using their bully pulpit to divide and to conquer. But with that said, yeah, you nailed it. Internet media, or the business model is to get clicks. And it turns out that the way to get clicks is not to do dispassionate, two-sided conversations in good faith. It's to call, I don't know, Wilk, a jerk who has sex with donkeys. Now, sorry, I probably shouldn't have said that. But when you start seeing that go around, it's going to outrage you and it's going to engage you, and your friends are going to be engaged, and it's going to be a war of insults, and people will feel they can't turn away from that because if they do so, they lose their reputation. The If the first lesson in my book is what we were talking about, which is it's not just an unstructured marketplace of ideas, it's a constitution of knowledge. The second idea is you're being manipulated.
Mm-hmm,
So the
mm-hmm.
techniques that that we see being used both online and in politics and in cable TV and elsewhere are tried and true, powerful and sophisticated propaganda methods that are at least a century old, often much older, and that exploit cognitive vulnerabilities that are wired into our animal brains. It doesn't matter how smart you are. In fact, in some ways, smart people are more vulnerable to forms of manipulation like repetition. The more often you hear something, the more likely you are to think it's true. Even repeating it in order to rebut it can cause this problem. Reversal. That's where you take any charge that's hurled at you and you just turn it around. I'm not the troll. You're the troll. Putin says, we didn't invade Ukraine, they invaded us, and so on. Another is the one that you referred to. It's often called trolling, but I
Mm-hmm.
call it attention hijacking. It
Mm-hmm.
is virtually impossible to ignore people who are out there slandering you and destroying your reputation. You're going to have to turn your attention to that. This is something President Trump and his followers are extremely good at. They use these insults to get attention and change the subject. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then another one that's used very commonly is a Russian technique called fire hose of falsehood. And that's where you just put so many lies, half-truths, exaggerations, conspiracy theories out there, including also you throw in some truths just to keep it confusing. But you pump so much of this stuff out through so many channels so loudly, you don't worry about consistency or plausibility, that you confuse people And you make him think, well, you know what? I'll never be able to tell what's true or false. I can't trust anybody to tell me what's true. And once you demolish their sense that they can tell the difference between truth and falsehood, then you open them to cynicism and polarization and believing all kinds of crazy things, or allowing people like opportunistic politicians to move into that information space and take it over. So the point I'm making, apart from these details, is don't think that you or I are too smart to fall for this stuff. We need to understand that we're up against some powerful forces. Another one, different direction, is what goes by the name of canceling. And that's where you manipulate the social environment to inhibit people so that they're reluctant to give their true views. Now, if you do that, you can create echo chambers, spirals of silence where I'm silent because you're silent, so I don't think anyone agrees with me. False realities. That's how small groups of people in places like universities, who are extreme and not representative of the larger community, can nonetheless dominate the conversation using these social weapons, and social media is one of them. So that's what we're up against, and it is a formidable, formidable task.
Yeah, I want to get back to the idea of these, these echo chambers and these silos that people find themselves in because they are afraid to talk. And there's so many people out there right now. When I think of how we got Donald Trump, just where people are with that whole thing now, I talk a lot, John, about how people did not engage in politics. So many people just didn't want anything to do with politics until they finally had enough. They became enraged. They saw so many things going on that they no longer wanted to sit by silently, and they looked for a champion in, this guy that's out there. He's very brash. He's just, attacking instead of, being a go along to get along Republican, things like that. Those those echo chambers, and then you combine that with what you were talking about, how all of a sudden there's so much coming at them, and they lose trust in all institutions. They lose trust in everything. They say, well, I can't believe in anything. And it's not that they don't believe in anything. They'll believe anything. I mean, at that point, it's not that they, you know, disbelieve everything that's out there. They'll believe almost anything. Almost anything at that point is plausible, because you're right. There's just so much information, so many things coming at them. I mean, like the QAnon nonsense, and the stuff with, I don't know. There's so many different narratives that have come out in the past several years, and people, going back to that idea that smarter people are even more susceptible to that kind of thing. I mean, I know some incredibly smart people out there, John, that they start talking, and I'm like, are you listening to yourself? Because this is
Yes.
not something that you would have even considered as being truthful 5, 10 years ago.
Yes. It turns out there have been multiple studies, and what they tend to find is that people with higher IQs use that intellectual firepower to rationalize whatever their pre-existing beliefs or motivated reasoning is. So it's like they're even better equipped to go down these rabbit holes in many cases. But yeah, Wilk, you just summarized the situation exactly right.
I think that it's a really good thing that I killed off as many brain cells with all the beer I've drank in my life, John, because I think it helps keep me out of those buckets sometimes. It's one of those things where, you know, I think as I got older and I lost some of that wisdom I thought I had when I was younger, things started to become clearer, and I can see
Well, that
past
might
things.
be old age, though. I don't see a lot of gray hair on your head. But let me just say, in reaction to that, that I am glad to see that old age has brought you some share of wisdom. But none of us as an individual is even in principle capable of seeing our own biases. So the only way we get to better knowledge of the outside world and of our own mistakes is in conversation with diverse people of other perspectives who disagree with us. And guess what? Humans hate doing that. We'd much rather interact with and read and watch people who agree with us and confirm our cherished opinions of ourselves and the world. So again, I'm sure you'll forgive me for continually circling back to braver angels, but what all of science is doing and journalism and braver angels in its own way is creating structures that require people to encounter people with different biases in their own, and that provide rules and norms that say, okay, here's the civil way to do it. If I write an academic paper for a journal, I am not going to begin it with Wilk, you ignorant slut. I'm going to begin it with a literature review. And there's a reason for all of that. And Braver Angels does the same thing. It requires people in many of its formats, the basic workshops, the debates, for example, it says, look, we're going to deliberately encounter the people we think are wrong and maybe even bad, but we're not just going to do it without any rules. We're going to do it in a way that's pretty much guaranteed to be respectful. Once you start doing it that way and people get over the initial shock of, oh my God, do I really have to do this? Do I need to sit next to this person? Once they begin to get the hang of it and get the rules, you've seen this, I've seen it, they leave that room saying, we're not as divided as we've been led to believe. And that is the core insight behind all of how you cope with this problem. It is, in fact, true. We've got strong opinion research on this. The public is divided, blue against red. But people's actual difference in stuff like policy, abortion, guns, immigration, you name it, it's only half as great as the perceived distance. We are not as divided as we've been led to believe.
That's right.
And once people understand that, that by itself reduces their hostility, their mistrust, and their openness to manipulation on the media. So a lot of what has to happen here is exposing ourselves to other views and finding and enabling those channels which allow us to do it well.
Oh, for sure. And let me just go back one thing real quick that nobody will ever have to apologize on this for this show, John, is mentioning Braver Angels, because this, you can mention Braver Angels and keep on bringing it up as many times as you want in the conversation, because I do believe it's one of the most important organizations out there. It's one of the greatest grassroots organizations pushing for this depolarization movement and leading in a lot of ways the movement towards depolarization in this country, and that's why I do so much work with them. So and then the next thing that I just want to stress again for people is we are not as divided as people are led to believe. And if you start with that conversation, if you allow yourself to be confronted with opinions different than your own, you will obtain knowledge. You will be able to work through some of the struggles that you have with yourself, because if you stay in that echo chamber, just like we talked about before, those silos, right? If that's the only thing you're listening to is people who agree with you, you're doing it wrong. I think you said that before, didn't you?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then this also changes people. I don't know, you may be an example of how it changes people, but once people develop this ability, these structures to approach different points of view, that can become habit forming in a good way. There's some researchers at Harvard who studied how people expect to feel when they encounter views that they disagree with and have conversations, versus how they actually wind up feeling when they come out the other end of those conversations. And you won't be surprised to learn that people greatly over exaggerate how unpleasant this kind of conversation will be. And in most cases, they walk away thinking, gee, I'm glad I had that conversation. So it's a little like, getting on the treadmill to exercise. You don't want to get up there. You don't want to do it. But once you've done it, you feel pretty damn good about it.
You
So the
do.
question becomes, that's what the Constitution of Knowledge is about, setting up the structures that incentivize people to do that work and to protect them from their own worst and laziest impulses, for the good of the advancement of knowledge and peace in society.
Right, right. No, I think that's a great analogy, the gym analogy or the working out analogy. The idea that the more that we do it, the more comfortable we become in doing it. The more we engage those with whom we disagree, the more comfortable. You know, it's just like getting on the mic here. When I first started doing this podcast, it was, the most ridiculous thing that I had ever done. I'd never done anything on a microphone before, but now I've actually got to speak on stage with some very high profile figures. I've got to do, hundreds of interviews on here with high profile people, and gained so much from that. Both people I agree and people that I disagree. I mean, John, I think in most respects, you and I probably disagree on quite a bit politically, but we can be fantastic friends because we've got a common cause. We love the truth. We love knowledge. We love the idea of depolarization and bringing our country together because we love this country. People need to really embrace the idea of doing things, that stepping outside their comfort zone more often to do things, and they then become, I mean, that comfort zone actually grows. The things you're uncomfortable with start to go away. I want to switch gears here just a little bit, John, and talk about something we were talking about in our pre-conversation, and that's the work that I've been doing, trying to rebuild truth and trust in our institutions, our public health institutions specifically, because uh, just because in recent weeks we had an article come out about Braver Angels that featured a lot about me and my work with Francis Collins that
And gave
led.
away your real first name, I might add, which I have promised not to reveal on this show.
I think people have figured it out now, but you know, with that came people looking into it a little bit more and finding videos of Francis Collins and I on stage in Gettysburg, and then that went viral, and man, did that bring out some anger in some people in that internet
What was the
ecosystem.
nature of the anger? What were they mad about?
Oh, there's, that this apology is no apology, and humility is too little too late, and yada yada. It's there was a lot of ugly out there, and I try not to focus on the ugly. One of the things that Braver Angels has helped me do in the past, in recent years, John, is not focus so much on the trolls and the those outrage entrepreneurs, but I started to be able to weed through that and pick out the positive as much as I can. But now, with that being said, I'm not gonna lie, I am also good friends with people who are still wildly disgusted with, and rightfully so, the actions of our government and our public health officials when it came to the government's response to the pandemic. But you had said something that I really want people to think about, in that if we don't, it was also something that they brought up in the book. If we don't allow people to step back with humility and retract, and I think you were referring to journalists in the thing, but I'm going to play it into the same thing with like Francis Collins, is if we don't allow people to look back on their actions and say, hey, I got this wrong. I got this wrong, and I'm stepping up right now and I'm saying I got this wrong. And I may not be able to fully make whole the damage I did with what I did, but I want to try and do something to make it right. I know that's not the words that you used in the book, but you talked about journalists, and Donald Trump specifically. I'll bring him up again. I mean, when he kind of went after, what was it, the CNN journalist for, uh, was it CNN or MSNBC, whoever it was,
Yeah,
right? It doesn't
some
matter.
CNN journalists
Yeah,
reported incorrectly
yeah, and
something, and they lost their jobs because they made that mistake. And Donald Trump said, "Well, this just shows the mainstream media is corrupt." And what it really showed is that the mainstream media was actually trying to set some standards.
trying to set some standards, trying to make things right. And while I can point to several things in many professions where people got things wrong and they step up and they try to take accountability for it. Now, I think there's a hell of a lot more that has to happen with regard to all the mistakes that were made in the government's response to the pandemic. I've got no problem in saying that, even though I consider Francis Collins or Dr. Francis Collins a good friend of mine now. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, but this is a stepping stone. This is a point of humility that people need to recognize, and the amount of time that it took to get this far, we need to really embrace the idea that people do make mistakes. People are human beings, and if we do not at least give some recognition for those who try to stand up and make right their mistakes, people aren't going to even make the attempt.
You said that so well, and I'm going to, by way of agreeing with you, I'm going to broaden your argument and say that all of science, all of knowledge depends on the principle that you just stated. And that's this principle. We kill our errors instead of each other. The way most human societies in the last 200,000 years of Homo sapiens have handled their disagreement is one side triumphs and kills off all the others, or banishes them, or throws them in jail, or silences them. The way you get rid of the mistake, or what you think is the mistake, is by getting rid of the person.
Mm-hmm.
The great breakthrough of science is it realized that is no way to advance knowledge, because the people who have the power are as likely to be wrong as they are to be right. So we kill our mistakes instead of each other. The goal here is Wilk Wilkinson can have an article or make a proposition, and when it's tested, he could turn out to be completely wrong, but we're not going to kill him. We're probably, unless he committed professional misconduct, we're not going to take his job away. We're going to say, okay, what can we learn from that mistake? And Wilk, hopefully, will go on and make other mistakes that we can learn from. But that's the whole process. So what cancel culture is doing is take away the ability to make mistakes by saying one wrong word on social media and you're out. Your job is over. No one will hire you. Your reputation is destroyed. That is a society of fear, not of learning. And on the other hand, take something like the pandemic. I understand that a lot of people made a lot of mistakes. How could they not? This is a situation we haven't seen in the United States since the time of the First World War. What bothers me is everyone rushing to the assumption that the other people were making mistakes on purpose. That it's because they were vicious elitists, or because they're pushing some kind of agenda into the schools, or because they hate people like you and me, or because they don't like Christianity and don't want us to go to church, on and on and on. The problem here is that good people working very hard to get it right are going to get it wrong.
That's
so
right.
What do we do about that? Well, in the heat of the pandemic, we make these mistakes, and yes, we're going to be upset about them. After the pandemic, it's time for after action. And that's where, instead of saying, Francis Collins got something wrong, he deserves to lose his reputation, we should all be furious at him. What needs to happen is what the military does, an after action report where you and Francis Collins and a lot of other people sit down and say, what do we learn from our mistakes? And to do that, we're going to have a certain amount of good faith that no one was trying to get this wrong on purpose, right? They just weren't. And until we cross that bridge of not confusing good faith error with bad motivation, we will not be able to learn from our mistakes.
No, that's exactly right. Whatever things anybody wants to call it. I mean, there's so many different narratives out there right now, John, where people are trying to ascribe bad motives to people who very well could have just, I mean, was it misconduct? Was it mistaken error? But without that, one of the things I talked to Jay Bhattacharya, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya about was morbidity and mortality conference that needs to take place. Get together the best and the brightest minds. And there are things that are obviously inexcusable. Something that you also talk about in the book Constitution of Knowledge is shutting down dissenting speech is never the right way to get to a good answer. It's there are things that are going to be very difficult to work through in the sense that uh the shutting down of dissenting speech, the coordination between certain government officials and social media outlets to squash what they decided or they were calling misinformation. That stuff is egregious. That stuff's ugly. That in my opinion is professional misconduct. But the errors have to be separated from the misconduct. We need to get to the bottom of so many things, and the only way we're going to be able to rebuild that trust in our public institutions is to find the truth, air out the truth, find those that did wrong, have people that were done wrong, air their grievances, find the people that did wrong, have them come to the forefront with some humility. But if we as a society have gone beyond the time when we allow those who have made mistakes to come forward with humility, we'll never get that conversation to happen. That is so important for
and
people to understand that.
and to treat them with intellectual generosity. Everyone made mistakes in the pandemic,
Yes. Yes.
and that's inevitable in that kind of situation. I would ask you, what was your view of Dr. Collins's conduct in the pandemic before you actually met him and got to know him?
Before I met him and got to know him, I mean, I was thoroughly disgusted with the government's response to the pandemic. In many ways, I still am. But I've been able to separate who I know Dr. Collins is as a human being, and what he did as head of the NIH, during the early days of the pandemic and things like that. What did I think? I mean, I was probably as mad as anybody else. I mean, I think I started speaking out against the government's response to the pandemic in May of 2020. So, I mean, early on, I was already fed up with the whole idea. The 2 weeks to flatten the curve never passed the smell test for me. The whole idea of shutting down society. The things that me and my drivers and other people in my communities were subjected to, and then I started having conversations with doctors and nurses and construction workers and people who were supposedly on the front lines and people who were supposedly essential workers. I started having all these conversations very early on, long before I got the opportunity to meet Dr. Francis Collins. And when they offered me that opportunity, or asked me if I wanted to be that guy, I was like, absolutely, absolutely. But I went into that whole thing with the idea of, this is not an overnight process. This is not something that can be fixed in a day. And the only way we're going to get through it is the true braver angel's way, right? Go into the conversation with true curiosity and without fear, and be able to speak your mind and listen to the other person speak theirs. And that I knew was going to be a long road. But one thing I've really taken away from that, John, is knowing that Francis Collins is a very good human being and a true believer in a lot of the things that he's done. But he also understands, like I said, that mistakes were made. To the extent of what he believes mistakes were and I think we're still a long ways apart on that. And I think we're gonna eventually uh get there. But again, I think in this age of instant gratification and people wanting their pound of flesh right now, you know, people are ready to, I saw people. Okay, so here's something, a couple things. I actually walked into a room with Francis Collins one time, and somebody literally said, "Never in my life have I been in the presence of such evil." I have never. I mean, I just could not believe that I actually heard that out of somebody's mouth. Talking about a guy that I actually know and have had several hours worth of conversations with. I thought that was pretty bad. So that was one thing. But then, after that video of us went viral, and I started reading the thousands of comments, as you probably know, because you've been a much bigger public figure than I have for a lot longer. But reading all those comments is probably not good in a
Yeah,
lot of
never read
respect.
the comments. Have
Never
someone
read
read them for you and send you the handful that are actually worth reading.
Right. Some of the stuff that I read that people were writing, I mean, they were posting pictures of a noose over the top of a gallows and calling for public executions. And and just, some of the ugliest stuff, one of the things that this internet ecosystem and the anonymity that's come along with it, John, I mean, it makes people very, very forward in presenting stuff that they would never present in their real life, right? And it's one of those things that I just hope the better of us comes out in the end, because if we do truly want to build, you know, like your book, it goes to that thing, a defense of truth, right? If we want to rebuild truth, or trust in our institutions, if we do want to find the truth, I mean, we're not going to get it, like you said, kill the bad ideas, don't kill the person. We have to be willing to let those that we place in positions of authority, we have to be willing to let them not only make mistakes, but then we have to learn from those mistakes.
Boy, you just put that beautifully. I have to ask you, what did you do, if anything, in the room where the person told Francis Collins that he was evil?
So they said it under their breath, and I didn't know that if he had heard it. I don't,
I see.
actually, I don't even think I've never asked him if he did hear it. But I'm sure he's heard worse. And I just was not even going to acknowledge the person, and I didn't.
Yeah, I
Just because it
guess I
was not
assumed that they'd said it in public to his face. Those are hard situations
yeah,
because it's just easier for everyone to say nothing. But I think it can be important and brave. We're called braver angels for a reason.
yeah,
Um, and it can be important and brave to be the person in that room who stands up for the right or the ability of the person we most disagree with to be heard.
yep, yep. Now, had that been said in a public setting, out loud or something, I would have had no problem confronting the idea. But it was one of those situations where I'm like, this is probably not the time or the place to make a scene. And like I said,
Oh, of
that
course,
person,
yes.
they did. I don't think they said it. Well, they certainly did not say it with the intention of it being heard by probably more than anybody. And like I said, I was right there. Because at first I'm like, is she talking to me? At that point, I realized quickly how, when I saw the Death Star, I realized quickly that it was not for me. But 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 yeah, had that been said out loud in a public setting, but I'm one of those people. Okay, if this woman wants to say that under her breath, and if Francis heard it, and he wants to confront the idea, that's fine. But this is not the
Well,
time nor the place to make
in
a
in
scene.
one sense, I sympathize with the person who said that only because since the dawn of humanity, it is one of our strongest tendencies to believe that the people who disagree with us on subjects that we feel strongly about are stupid or evil.
Yep. Yep, that's right.
And they've got to be one or the other, because if you weren't stupid or evil, you couldn't possibly believe those things. But the foundation of the constitution of knowledge, it's, science and the whole search for truth, is that we are often wrong when we are most certain that we're right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we have to be put in situations where others are allowed to disagree with us, and we are forced to learn from that. And you know what? We will never get this stuff completely right. In fact, what I think might now happen, we were lucky with COVID. It turned out not to be nearly as deadly as people initially feared it might be. You remember those first few months.
Oh,
We
for
didn't know
sure.
what we
For
were
sure.
looking
Yep.
at. And the initial cases, there was some really scary stuff. I had COVID in this past November. It was like a cold, right? But it wasn't
Mhm.
always like that.
Right.
So now I'm worried that we overlearn that lesson. And the next one really is the one we're afraid of. And this time, maybe we don't do enough because we did too much last time.
Mm-hmm.
And then what am I going to do? And I'm going to say, well, that's evil. No, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to say, you know what? It is really hard to be human.
It,
And it is very hard to learn from your mistakes in the appropriate way, but that's what we are fated to try to do.
no, that's absolutely right. One of the things that I've talked to, both Dr. Collins and Dr. Bhattacharya both about is the idea that because of the way that this last one was handled, and because of the way that so many people feel about that response to that pandemic. Now, I mean, you're right. There's if another one comes along
A
that
worse one.
a worse one or even one comparable. But because this, in my opinion, I mean, not in my opinion, I mean, it's a fact. This did kill a lot of people, right? But not nearly in the numbers that they had anticipated or whatever. And some of the things, not everything that they did was wrong and whatever, as some people would have you believe. And then there's others who believe that the whole thing was made up and they call it a scamdemic. Well, that's all nuts, right? In my opinion. But if another pandemic comes by tomorrow or the next day or soon, and we are in the spot that we are today with so many people lacking trust in our public health institutions and our government itself, we will end up worse coming out of that one than we did with this one. I mean,
And yes, I think
it's just a
I
fact.
fear that too. And it's not as if trust was high to begin with
That's right.
this time
That's right.
around. One thing that I think will be better next time around, at least for the generation that lived through COVID, is I think the process will be better.
Yeah.
I think more voices will be heard and there will be more tolerance of different viewpoints. I think the public health establishment will be a little more modest and a little more considerate of goals other than just saving lives on paper.
That's right.
That's a hard lesson that I think a lot of us have learned.
Hmm.
So I think the process will be better next time around. I
Yeah.
just hope that something else that gets better is a little more humility on the part of you and me and everyone else who in the instant when it's happening, we're so darn sure we're right,
Hmm. Hmm.
but maybe
No,
we're wrong.
that's right. That's exactly right. People, and it goes back to what we said right at the beginning of this, right? It all starts with a conversation. We have to have an open dialogue about all things. And if we do not have that conversation, we miss out on so much knowledge. We miss out on so many things. And so, I can't encourage people enough to just really open up your mind and heart with a little humility. Have conversations with people that you disagree with. I mean, you can vehemently disagree with somebody and still have a civil conversation. You just have to look at it through a lens of humanity. You have to be able to see that the person that you're looking at is another human being and not some
Yes.
monster with ill intent.
And I'll give you, I sense we're coming toward a conclusion. So I'm going to give you two important tips for how to do that. The first is something that I learned from Braver Angels, but also from research for my book. And if you want to have that conversation with someone you disagree with in a way that's more likely to turn out well as a good experience for both of you, don't start with the facts. Don't start with, I'm going to convince you you're wrong and here's why. Start with this question. What is it about your experience in life that led you to this opinion?
Beautiful.
Because you're showing curiosity, which people respond to positively. Maybe he cares or she cares about me. And you're translating the axes from facts, which are very difficult to talk about, to stories, which people love to tell. And you will be surprised how often that question can lead the conversation in a way that leads to more constructive disagreement or at least better understanding. Now,
Hmm.
the second tip, the really important tip for getting this right, is to buy The Constitution of Knowledge by Jonathan Rauch, available at fine bookstores everywhere.
Absolutely. The Constitution of Knowledge, The Defense of Truth. One of the most important books I've read.
One of, I thought you liked me.
Oh, John, you are a dear friend and somebody I look forward to so many more conversations with. And yeah, incredible book. Just so many important life lessons. And you know what? I am looking forward to many more conversations with you. Jonathan Rauch, such a good friend of Braver Angels, good friend of mine, and somebody I look forward to many more conversations with in the future. Thank you.
I'd love to come back anytime.
Friends, if there's anything in this episode that provided exceptional value to you, please make sure to hit that share button. Share it with your friends, share it far and wide. And of course, if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe right from our website so you can get the Derate the Hate podcast sent to your email inbox every week. So this is Wilk wrapping up for the week saying get out there, be kind to one another, be grateful for everything that you've got, and remember it's up to you to make each and every day the day that you want it to be. If there is something that you would like to share with me, you can catch me on most social media platforms, or you can email me directly, wilk@wilksworld.com. With that, my friends, I am going to back on out of here, and we will catch you next week. Take care.